interesting is we left off with Lee Iacocca in the early 90s from our last project, and that Chrysler was in an upswing. They were enjoying success. And in the later years, in the later 90s, they actually went back to crisis, and then these new executives come in and bring them back up to success. So the constant change in management is still valid. Now, just a couple of facts to justify the financial crisis. First of all, they were on the verge of bankruptcy. It was on the table as a consideration. When it says it had to lay off 26,000 workers, that's the new management. When the new executives came in, they were forced to lay off 26,000 workers and reduce the budget from $48 billion, the production budget, from $48 billion to $36 billion. So that is a very, obviously a very large reduction in budget. Now, the management crisis, basically American employees were fearful that German executives were not going to do things the way they liked. They weren't going to treat them the way they felt they should be treated, etc. Really what it was they just didn't know what to expect. They were really just fearful of another culture. So, sorry about that. Right. So now, these are the leaders that they brought in. Dieter Zetsche on the left with the glasses and the mustache. He's known as the genial character. He's very easy to get along with. We actually chose these pictures because to show the contrasting personalities. He's a nice smiling guy, almost kind of looks like your grandfather or something. And the gentleman on the right, his name is Wolfgang Bernhard. Wolfgang more or less worked underneath of Zetsche, and we chose this picture for two reasons. Like I said, to show the personality. He's obviously, as he appears to be, like a rugged sort of gentleman. He's a very straightforward kind of guy, as the books describe him, and the exact word that I've used to describe him from what I read would be blunt. He just was straightforward with the employees and told them exactly what he needed, what he expected, and that was that. Now the bike he's on, just to clarify, it's called a Tomahawk, and it was not meant to ever go into production. It was actually just supposed to be a concept car to generate buzz at the auto show, and it did that, and it definitely got Chrysler noticed that show, and they weren't supposed to go into production. But just a little tidbit here: Jay Leno actually ended up buying one for $250,000. So, as did a couple other car collectors. So that's the background of the leaders. Now, to elaborate and to show you where they've been, Zetsche started. He's a great deal older than Bernhard. He started at Mercedes in '76 in the research department, and you'll see how Bernhard's history sort of contrasts his own. Bernhard started working for Mercedes at McKinley & Company Consulting. So, McKinley & Company was doing work for Mercedes at the time. So he started in 1990. By '92, Bernhard becomes a Mercedes project manager, which is not a very high position, but it's an executive position. And by 1998, Daimler Chrysler is formed, and at this point, Bernhard had worked his way up relatively far by now. And by 2000, the two of them, Bernhard and Zetsche, are both top-notch employees, and they are sent to America to run Chrysler, which was, I should mention, was recently purchased by Daimler Mercedes. So now, as for what they accomplished in the company and how the Chrysler and Nissan compare, reciprocity was an important thing. As if you recall from Lee Iacocca, that was important for him as well. A good leader retains human capital in areas which the leader himself lacks. So Ghosn created cross-functional teams, which beyond just himself, it created a lot of expertise for people. It made a lot of executives in the department understand things that they hadn't previously, because they were working with people who had strengths where they were weak. So that's how he dealt with the issue of reciprocity. And Zetsche had a doctorate in engineering, and as the last slide showed you, he started in the research department, so he had a more scientific background, and Bernhard had his doctorate in economics, so he had a more business background. So the two of them contrasted each other well. So both Nissan and Chrysler fare very well with the issue of reciprocity. Now the next thing that was important before also was strategic alliances, which is basically just them being able to leverage the partnerships they've created. So Nissan, being a part of Renault, actually shared platforms of the car, So more or less, you buy Model A, and it would have the exact same chassis as Model B, just different bells and whistles, so to speak. Chrysler draws on the expertise of Mercedes, and they did this a little bit differently. Only in one case can I remember, I think it was the 300, that they took an actual Mercedes chassis and used it for Chrysler. Basically what this is mainly talking about is the Crossfire, which was a fairly popular model and still is of Chrysler, that actually used Mercedes engineering techniques and applied that to the design of the car. It didn't straightforward use parts, etc. from Mercedes. A global mindset, that's another important issue in both companies, and I'll just tell you exactly what it says here. A good leader should have a global mindset that allows him to accept other cultures. Now, obviously for Ghosn, as a Frenchman, going into a Japanese company, he had to have a global mindset and accept other cultures. For Zech and Bernard, they were Germans coming into America. They had to have an open global mindset and come in and accept the culture. Avoiding ethnocentrism, that's pretty much, it's pretty much self-explanatory, but to elaborate on it a little bit, they had to not focus exactly the opposite. Ethnocentrism is kind of an exact opposite of global mindset. They had to not focus on how they did things in Germany. They had to focus on how you need to do things in America. How do you motivate American workers? How do you bring ideas out of your American employees, your American executives? Not those things that worked in Germany may not work in America. The Hofstede study applies, and the Hofstede study was done on American management techniques to see if they would work in other countries. But it applies here in a general sense, just because management techniques in one country may not work, and in fact didn't, for Ghosn at least, didn't work in another country. A recent topic was organizational socialization, and obviously that's extremely important for foreign managers. Not so much for global mindset is sort of one end of the spectrum, where the executives have to have the employees getting used to the executives. Okay. Now, organizational socialization is more like the executives have to get used to the employees. So it's more, it's a difficult subject, but they're almost at other ends of the spectrum. Now, Ghosn at Nissan used the more formal process of organizational socialization when he actually set out on paper, we're going to have these cross-functional teams, everybody's going to work in this direction, that direction, etc. And then Bernard and Zech at Chrysler used a more informal process where they basically were hands-on kind of managers. They went into the factories and just saw what was going on, more so than Ghosn did. And that's basically just of the organizational socialization. And the social influence process, of course, is important. Probably, in my opinion, one of the most important topics. How do you get people to do what you want them to do? And Ghosn used the consultation approach, more or less, which basically he politely asked people and was real with people about, you need to do this, you need to do that. Bernard and Zech more used the exchange approach, which I don't think we touched on our last presentation. The exchange approach is more of making those promises, and Bernard and Zech made promises to stray from the big three image that they had, the being based in Detroit image, and they actually were unable to accomplish that, which put a strain on Chrysler, and may have been one of the factors to throw them back into crisis. So they made promises, but one of those promises was unable to be fulfilled. So, and finally, we have judgmental heuristics. How did judgmental heuristics affect them? And Chrysler and the hindsight bias. Okay, and Chrysler, the executives of Chrysler, I mean to say, Bernard and Zech, they needed to keep their ideas behind them. More or less because their ideas were coming from Germany, where things were different than America. They needed to keep those ideas behind them, and they needed to focus more on the present, what they could do now. That may have been one of the things